Good evening, everyone, and welcome to ICM's lecture series, where we are hosting Dr. Khalid Mustafa Medani today. I'm Esra Akcan. I'm the resident director of ICM this year, filling in for the founding and permanent director, Salah Hassan. And let me start with a couple of acknowledgements. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakohono. The Gayakohono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayakohono that dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayakohono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. ICM would also like to add Cornell's founding was enabled in the course of a national genocide by the sale of almost 1 million acres of stolen Indian land under the Morrill Act of 1862. To date, the university has not offered any form of restitution to the hundreds of native communities impacted. So for this talk, I would also like to thank Ashley Saxdale, for ICM's program manager, for organizing this event, and thank you for coming. Professor Medani is Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies, where he's also the chair of the African Studies program at McGill. He has taught at Oberlin College and Stanford University. Dr. Medani received a BA with honors in Development Studies from Brown University, an MA in Development Studies from the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University, and an MA and PhD in Political Science from the University of California at Berkeley. His research focuses on globalization and the political economy of Islamist and ethnic politics in Africa and the Middle East, with a special focus on Sudan, Egypt, and Somalia. He has an extremely long list of publications, which I will not read, but let me mention only a few. Most relevant for today is that he's the author of Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa. This book came from Cambridge University Press in 2021. And this book received an award from the American Political Science Association for the best book in the field of Middle East and North Africa politics by a senior scholar in 2022. He's presently working on a manuscript on the politics of protest, with a focus on the causes and consequences of Sudan's 2018 popular uprising for the prospects of democratization in this country. In addition, he has published on the roots of youth militant recruitment, the debate over terrorist finance, and civil conflict in the Horn of Africa, with a special focus on the armed conflicts in Sudan and Somalia. His work has appeared in Political Science and Politics, the Journal of Democracy, the Journal of North African Studies, Current History, Middle East Report, Review of African Political Economy, Arab Studies Quarterly, and the UCLA Journal of Islamic Law. And I cannot help but read the endorsement of this book by the American Political Science Association's Middle East and North Africa Politics section. Quote, Khalid Mustafa Medani has written a highly original account that explains how economic globalization, particularly labor remittances originating in the Gulf states, and so how economic globalization impacted social, religious, and political communities in Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia. Despite robust scholarly literatures focused on migration, militant groups, informal networks, and political economy, Medani has written a breakthrough account linking these diverse subjects in a single coherent narrative. He argues that boom and bust cycles of capitalist inflows interacted with underlying levels of state capacity and local political cultures to construct divergent social and political outcomes. An instant classic, Medani's expert case knowledge and facility in bringing diverse scholarly literatures makes this book an exemplar for the field of comparative politics. And of course, so many congratulations for this award and endorsement. So his CV also has a lot of, a long list of fellowships, grants, and awards. So I will just list a couple. He's a previous recipient of the Carnegie Scholar on Islam Award from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And most recently, he was awarded a Woodrow Wilson Scholarship from the Center for International Scholars with the same name. So Dr. Medani has also worked as a researcher at the Brookings Institution at Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation. And he has also worked with a variety of international organizations, including the United Nations Development Program and the UN Office of the Coordinator of Humanitarian Affairs. He has served as a senior consultant on issues such as the Darfur crisis, youth politics in Sudan, the electoral reforms in Morocco. He has worked as a consultant for a variety of governments on these topics, including United States, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and Norway. So I'm really looking forward to this lecture. And after the lecture, we will have a short reception at the History of Art Gallery. The room number is GM08. We can just walk there together. So please join me in welcoming.
I'm glad I got your gift. Thank you very much, Professor Archan, for this wonderful and generous introduction. I think I want to come to Cornell at least once every month or so. I'm going to be introduced like that. Really, I genuinely appreciate it for you to read all of that, not only the academic work, but also some of the policy work that I've been interested in. I am delighted and honored to be here in Ithaca in general, and of course in Cornell in particular. And I am very honored that the Institute for Comparative Modernities has invited me. I took a quick look at all of the activities and the previous lectures and speakers, and so I was very humbled by that. So I'm really, really honored to be able to present some of the aspects of this book of mine. So I want to thank Professor Archan, Professor Dadi, if he's here. I haven't met him yet. And of course, Dr. Salah Hassan, who happens to be also from Sudan, where I'm from, and we go back a long way. And in relation to that, I also want to thank the support and acknowledgement of the Africana Studies Research Center, which I've heard a great deal about for many years since I was an undergraduate decades ago at Brown University, not very far away. And as chair of African Studies, we always follow the activities of Cornell's Africana Studies. So very, very honored by that as well. This is the title of my book, Black Markets and Militants. And I want to begin with the title of the talk itself. I thought I'd try to get your attention. Is it working? The first thing, of course, one notices is the cover, which I am very pleased about for a number of reasons. Number one, it is a street in Cairo, one of my own mother's favorite streets in the historic city of Cairo. But it also represents an aspect of this talk. And since I know that there's some here from the School of Architecture, this is Shari al-Mu'izz li-Din al-Ali in the historic Islamic quarters of Cairo. It originated and was established. I'm not going to talk about Cairo's architecture, but it's really important to emphasize really the general theme of this book and this lecture. This was in the 10th century very, very important as the gateway, the access, the artery of all of the different markets in the great city of Cairo. In addition to that, the prestige of Khan Khalili and this Islamic Cairo, for those of you who have visited this great, very important historic city, the prestige also led to the development of Islamic religious institutions, including not only the domes and minarets that you see there in the distance, but also charitable institutions as well. This nexus between markets and religion that is very much part and parcel of what Islamic Cairo is really about, although there's so many facets to this global city, is very much linked to the title of this talk, which is, as you can see here, the great transformation in the Middle East and Africa, globalization, informal markets, and the politics of identity. It is, of course, an ambitious title, and I thought, why not? I want to talk about the Great Transformation and everything in the Middle East and Africa. Of course, the Great Transformation is referenced or is a reference from Kaufmann's great book, The Great Transformation, the political and economic origins of our time. It is a central concept of this lecture and of this book. And hopefully, as I go along, I'll be able to highlight some of the important aspects of his contribution to my work, not others, but that has been very, very important. I want to begin with definition of terms, just to be clear in terms of what I'm talking about. By globalization, here I mean something very specific. That is the internationalization and the openness of domestic economies to international economic forces, specifically the outmigration, particularly from North Africa and the Horn of Africa to the Gulf countries in the 70s. And for 5 decades, that has been extremely important and consequential in terms of the politics of what we call these labor-sending countries or labor-exporting countries. So here I'm looking at economic globalization in a very specific sense, and I'll elaborate on that. The issue and the central theme here is the informal markets that I've spent many years working on. That is really directly related and builds upon the insights of Polanyi and others. And it is the focus really of the most important part of this talk. Polanyi's contribution, of course, to the understanding of markets is that he takes us away from that kind of notion of the pristine or the neutral market and looks at the relationship between the state and the market and market processes, which is an important element of this talk. I'm going to apply this to the countries of Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia. But the great transformation I'm talking about is really the marketization associated with the outmigration of labor and the inflow of capital inflows. And I'm making this ambitious claim, but I'm going to hopefully prove it empirically that this has actually led to drastic changes in the social and political life of many of the countries of the Middle East and Africa. That becomes an important aspect. In terms of the politics of identity, here I refer to something that many who have read the book or invited me to talk, and especially in the policy realm, are interested in, and that is the issue of Islamism, the politics of Islamism itself. And here I have always been interested in actually unpacking what we mean by political Islam and Islamism. As you probably know, and it has always been a concern for me, Islamist politics has always been foregrounded as the source of the problem or something to be explained. And as someone from Sudan and from this region or from any Muslim country, I don't have to tell this audience, the plurality of Muslims in Muslim majority countries has been obscured in the context of trying to figure out the causes of political Islam. The consequences of this, I would argue, and this is why I've always been interested in policy as well as academic work, has been problematic in terms of the securitization of Islamist informal financial networks. And when I speak briefly about Somalia, I'm going to explain how impactful and important that has been in the context not only of Somalia, but the global war on terrorist finance or against terrorist finance. I'm not going to talk about that too much, but it is in the latter chapters of this project. And finally, there is an empirical or conceptual issue that's also related to politics, and that is the reduction of Muslims to their religious motivation. The notion that the first order of business or adherence to any kind of social political action is grounded in Muslims' identity as Muslims. And one of the reasons I wanted to show this particular representation, and even though my Sudanese colleagues and friends were asking me why isn't Sudan on the cover, it really is nothing against Sudan. I'm going to talk about Sudan as well, but really to make clear that the historical, and this is only one aspect of Islamic history, is really one of pluralism, where Islam has been really a source of great plurality and, of course, cosmopolitanism. And that becomes really an important part of what this lecture is about. There are two questions. I may not be able to get into the details, of both of them, but just for us to be on the same page and in order to stimulate conversation and discussion. Two empirical questions that this book addresses that have been very, very important to my research and of course many others. The first is really the relationship between the global economy and Islamist politics. In the reading of of works on Islamism, I have always found that the external aspect, the global economy, has always not been part of or included as part of the causal explanation of Islamist activism in particular, in terms of that literature. And the second question is probably the one that I think is really central to this lecture and book, and that is this question of when do religious rather than ethnic cleavages serve as the most politically salient source of identification. It's really this puzzle coming from where I came from or come from, where you have, of course, majority Muslim populations, but a diversity of ethnicities. And this is really very much part and parcel of my training in African politics, not only Middle Eastern politics, where you really see the polarity of different forms of cleavages, ethnic and religious, combined in different ways, particularly in Islamic Africa, which is so important. These questions, of course, are posed against what I have always found to be conventional and unsatisfying explanation of Islamist activism, and that is the focus on Islamic doctrine and ideology, which is so important among so many scholars, the exclusive emphasis on geopolitics, which I know here I'm being a bit provocative, and most importantly, the focus exclusively on formal and institutional linkages to the state. That is the role of the state and formal institutions. And so I've spent many years in these different countries looking at something a little bit different, that is informal institutions, which I find to be really the most important conceptual way to understand diversity and Islamist politics. These are the three outcomes I'm going to explain. I have these images, hopefully not to distract you, but just to highlight what I'm going to be discussing in empirical terms. There are three case studies here that I've looked at closely. One, of course, is Egypt, Sudan, and then Somalia. And here these pictures kind of illustrate the different outcomes I'm will try to explain. That is Islamist politics of the Egyptian variety. These are the Muslim Brotherhood, a largely middle-class Islamist movement. Many of you are familiar with its origin and evolution. The Islamist movement here, led by the former dictator Omar Bashir in Sudan, also originates in the expansion and popularity of the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan. And in Somalia, not so much Muslim Brotherhood Islamist activism, but clan politics, inter-ethnic politics. And what I've tried to do, of course, in the book is to weave these different outcomes and have an overall explanation for these different forms of Islamist activism and different forms of ethnic politics in these three countries, which I believe are representative for other countries in the Middle East and Africa. In the process, of course, one cannot talk about diversity of Islamist activism if I was to focus just on the middle-class Islamist movements in Egypt and Sudan, or middle-class based. I also looked at youth militant recruitment, and that is essentially, what is the difference? How can we distinguish, not only in terms of course, violent action, but in terms of causes? How do we distinguish middle-class Islamist-based movements from their militant variety? And here, I'm going to briefly talk about the work that I did among former militants in the neighborhood of Imbabe in Cairo, which really help us understand the motivations behind why young people join Islamist militant organization. Here, the focus is on social and economic incentives and not doctrine, ideology, or even foreign policy, which is really important to understand. But I don't want to begin with Egypt or Sudan. Egypt, of course, has the cover, and Sudan is where I'm from, and I have my own biases, but it is Somalia that is the most important in our understanding of the great transformation in the Middle East and Africa. And that, I want to repeat that, it is Somalia that has the most important lessons for us in terms of what Kaufmann talked about in terms of the consequences of market society. And I want to use an African or more specifically Somali proverb in order to introduce the overall framework here. Abundance and scarcity, and the book opens with this, abundance and scarcity are never far apart. The rich and the poor frequent the same houses. This, of course, expresses the notion of boom and bust cycles and the precarious relationship among boom periods, economic downturns, recessions, and their social and political consequences. So here you have a Somali proverb that is really based on expressing this notion of instability, economic insecurity, but also the boom and bust cycles. And while it is widely acknowledged that exogenous shocks, that is economic shocks from the outside, are extremely impactful for our understanding of the trajectory of advanced industrialized countries, we don't really have, in a systematic fashion, really models that look at the role of economic globalization as it impacts the least developed countries. And that has been a source of a theoretical concern for me with political consequences. Mostly because, as you know, in terms of state capacity, it is actually the less developed countries, for lack of better terms, that are actually more vulnerable to exogenous economic shocks. Yet when we read about Islamism in Egypt, Sudan, or Al-Shabaab in Somalia, or this kind of political violence, one element that is always missing is the external factor. And this is a very, very important proverb that I think acknowledges this kind of issue. But it also can be represented in an image. For someone like me who spent many months in Somalia, this is not unfamiliar. On here you see, of course, where the proverb really has a great deal of weight, so to speak, or pertains to what is largely a nomadic and pastoralist community throughout Somalia. And of course, climatic and ecological changes is what that proverb refers to. But it also refers to boom periods. And here in Mogadishu, you'll see these very middle class and upper class buildings that are essentially financed by Somalis abroad, expatriates abroad, that utilizing informal channels of remittances sent from their families, let's say in Montreal, where I'm coming from, or Minneapolis, where there are many Somalis, and mostly from the Gulf countries, really are able to develop this kind of wealth, so to speak, in adjacent to ecological crisis. So what do I mean by the great transformation and labor migration? I think many of you from the Arab region and from African sending countries as well, this is not an unfamiliar sight of laborers waiting in line, in this case, to migrate to the oil-producing countries. Over the last 5 decades, the boom and bust cycles in the Gulf countries in particular resulted, and this is where the great transformation argument comes in the great transformation of not only the economies of these countries, but the political, cultural landscape completely. The Middle East and North Africa are no longer the same because of the labor migration. And anyone in these countries can give you different examples, but that is really important. In addition to that, and specifically, the reason this led to a great transformation was because it had important influences on state capacities of these countries, economic policies of these countries, and the transformation of identity politics, which is part, of course, of this title. And I'll show that to you empirically in a little bit. But I do want to quote, just to support this great transformation thesis, that Charles Tilly, and I quoted in the book, has a very memorable quotation in which he says, remittances of labor migrants are not only big business for individuals, families, and communities, but for all national economies, for entire national economies. And here we have to look at both the local effects, but also the global aspects of these. So essentially, just like other countries, Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia became major labor exporters that witnessed a boom in expatriate remittances in the 70s and early 1980s. By the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, labor remittances also declined after a period of boom. So what we have are two periods of boom and bust, which become really important, and different outcomes in the different periods that the book covers. Essentially, this book covers the first part of it are the discussion of Sudan, Egypt, and Somalia during a boom period of labor remittances. The second part of the book covers the consequences as labor remittances from the Gulf declined, generating recession, and in combination with economic neoliberal reforms led to different consequences. In the boom, they circumvented official financial institutions and had the unintended consequences of undercutting the state's fiscal and regulatory capacities, while simultaneously fueling the expansion of informal markets in finance, in land, and labor. I'll show you the consequences in a minute. Importantly, in this period, in the period of the boom, 70s and 80s, this expansion of informal market relations was not free market operated or did not operate along free market lines. And here is where we need Polanyi and others and economic sociologists to help us, but rather they were regulated by something else, norms, kinship networks, Islamist networks that were very, very effective in cultivating a shared notion of cohesion, but also, as I argue in the book, following Polanyi, both submitted individual actors and communities to the market, but also provided them protection from the market through these informal networks. The changes occur in the recession period in the 1980s, the mid-1980s, as many of you who know the region well, and the Gulf in particular, actually oil prices fell and slumped in 1983, and that led to recessions not only in the Gulf, but of course a decline in informal remittances to these countries. In all three countries, here's where divergence occurred. So where I discuss in the book that Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia followed similar political and economic trajectories, it is really in the 1980s that we see divergence. And yes, I am comparing Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia together through what the concept, of course, of most similar cases. However, this model can equally apply to Jordan and to Morocco and to Yemen, and to Nigeria in different ways, as I'll show in a minute. And that is an important aspect of this talk. It is here in the economic crisis of during the recession in the 1980s and even to the present day that you have a change, an erosion of the links between informal economic relations and the state and the imposition of economic reform policies that led to very different outcomes in these countries. It produced in Sudan the consolidation of an Islamist authoritarian regime. In Egypt, it led to the factionalization of the Islamist movement between more accommodationist, middle class, and militant variety. And as I show in the book, in Somalia, it completely destroyed the formal institutions of the state, directly leading to the collapse of the Somali state. There are three elements to keep in mind that bring these comparative cases together that I emphasize in the book. And that is, what do we and what can we learn from the literature on internationalization taken from that advanced industrialized countries, and what does it mean for understanding of economic globalization and the politics of identity in the Middle East and Africa. And this is taken from the book, but I thought it would be very helpful for those interested in other countries in the Middle East and in North Africa. First, internationalization, particularly in the form of the outmigration of labor and the inflow of labor remittances, leads, as I said, to the expansion of informal financial sectors and informal labor markets. I'll show that specifically in the case of Egypt. But I wanted to highlight the second aspect here that I don't think political scientists have focused on as much as we should, and that is that these processes of internationalization and their consequences for domestic economies lead to political conflict over exchange rate policy. I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with Egypt or follow Egypt. Just as an example, in August, you had the deputy, or rather the head of the central bank in Egypt, who was dismissed, resigned, over deep conflict over exchange rate policies and his interest rate policies. This is not a small affair. We leave it to the realm of economists and others. But as we know, whether it's in Egypt, Sudan, or Somalia, really conflicts over exchange rates are very, very important. In the case of Sudan, this book and the original idea for it came from incidences in the early 1990s in Sudan, where the state was actually not only detaining those working in the black market, but they were actually executing members that they allegedly said were disturbing the exchange or monopolizing or manipulating the exchange rate. In context like Sudan and even Egypt and Somalia, and definitely in diverse countries, these political conflicts over the currencies, and you'll see that very clearly in Sudan and Somalia these days, often maps along religious, ethnic, and not only class lines. And this becomes a really important aspect of what I'm going to discuss when I discuss the countries, that this is not a small affair, and this is a really important aspect of conflicts in these countries. Before I go and talk about the countries themselves, which I know will be of interest to people who are interested, whether it's in the Horn of Africa or the Middle East, I just wanted to be clear that what I'm talking about is a global phenomenon. I'm not going to talk about labor remittance globally, but this is a very quick map I found on Google Images just yesterday, and I thought, I wanted to emphasize how important this kind of informal financial services are globally, not only for Sudan, Egypt, and Somalia, the Middle East, 67%. We can't, of course, be 100% accurate, but this gives you a general idea. 67% of the adult population do not use formal or even semi-formal financial services, 80% in sub-Saharan Africa. This really is important. The generosity of Africans and Middle Easterners, and you can see in Latin America, towards their family, are really part and parcel of the global economy. And unfortunately, in my field, we don't have enough work in terms of the politics of labor migration that we must take seriously. I'm going to use Somalia quickly to emphasize what that means to local communities, but this gives you a quick illustration. It is once again in Somalia that we find the lessons that we can draw. There are very few countries where the majority of the population relies on labor remittances for the great part of their economic livelihood. Somalia is that country. And in Somalia, when I was working there with many Somali colleagues and friends, we did a large survey on these informal remittances to local communities. We went to over 400 different villages to understand the impact and the flow of these networks. It is wanted to quickly talk about or show you what I mean by informality. For those of you, whether it's in the Middle East or in West Africa or elsewhere, and certainly also in South Asia, you will recognize this kind of Hawala networks that were criminalized after 9/11 by the US Treasury Department. Importantly, one of the reasons that they were seen to be suspicious is these are informal financial networks, as you can see here, where Abdul here, for example, in Minnesota, or let's say in Dubai, wants to send money to his relative Muhammad, and he contacts someone, Somali, let's say Yasmin in Minnesota or elsewhere, and asks for that money to be delivered to Muhammad. The problem with this kind of informal transfer for, of course, the security issues in terms of the geopolitics of 9/11 and the global war on terrorism is that there is no paper record of these kind of transfers. It is based exclusively on trust. It is difficult to emphasize enough the way that Somalis, based on their clan lineages, trust each other in terms of these remittances. And when I left Somalia, I would get calls to send remittances as if I became part of one of the clans, which I did in a way. That's because that's how it happened. This, of course, reflects a central theme of the book and the title, one of the titles, and that is Informal Networks. And here I want to emphasize that this conceptual aspect that for me is so important and I think needs further research. And that is that Polanyi-esque kind of a notion that social networks here secure control over informal economic transactions and labor, as I said, not only by submitting people to the full to market forces, but also insulating them from full impact of the market. And in addition to that, protecting them from repressive rulers. And that becomes really important. This is, of course, very much referencing the double movement of Karl Polanyi, that you have on one side, historically, a movement of a variety of actors for a laissez-faire kind of self-regulating market, and the counter movement of protection, actors really fighting against or resisting the market. And Somalis have done that through their clan networks in a context where the state capacity and formal institutions eroded, and even the state, it is these informal networks that both submit Somalis to the market, but also protects them from these kind of markets. Very quickly, just to emphasize the importance of these remittances for Somalis, this is from the survey I conducted. It is 40% of urban households rely on these labor remittances. So we went household to household to do this survey. But in addition to that, rural Somalis also rely on them. But this is deceptive. While it says here 5 or 10% of rural households rely on labor remittances, the truth is that from our research, what we found is that urban Somalis actually utilizing the trust networks based on clan actually send regularly remittances from the urban areas to the rural areas. So here you have a global economy. You have Somali expatriates from abroad sending money through this system to their urban relatives and clan members. And those members in the urban areas then send money to their rural areas. A country that has been previously represented as living in the shadow of the global economy is actually very central in the global economy. And how can we look at this kind of model for those interested in other countries, Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia, although I hope that these will be the major focus. I want to just quickly highlight the argument so I can get into some of the empirical story that I think may be of more interest. The argument here is one that is quite straightforward and parsimonious. I make a big point in the book that when you're parsimonious in this context, one has to be modest. But at the same time, it's very important to understand that this is applicable to other countries as well. For Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia, the expansion of the parallel market and informal financial sectors led to diverse outcomes, as I said. And there are three elements that I think it's important to keep in mind in trying to understand the divergence. How did these labor export countries begin in the same processes and then end with such divergence? And there are three elements here that I trace throughout the book through every case. One is state capacity, simply. The capacity of these states to regulate their economy, that becomes important. The capacity also to actually wield a repression is extremely important. These two elements distinguish Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia, with Egypt having the highest capacity for regulation, Somalia medium capacity, and Somalia the weakest capacity. Therefore, Somalia being the one that represents the greatest example of Polanyi's market society. But in order to understand the politics of identity, here we have to look at local structural cleavages. And in the book, I can't rehearse them all here, but in the book, I actually trace the different ethnic, cultural, and structural differences in Egyptian, Sudanese, and Somali communities, looking at religious, sectarian, urban, rural divides, and the industrial, commercial, depending on the country itself. These three factors have led to the outcomes that are so different and continue to be very relevant for these countries. Number one, following the recession that I spoke about, Egypt was able, through economic policy, to consolidate itself and defeat or undermine the popularity of the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood. And here I look at financial clout of the Muslim Brotherhood, where others have looked at other factors. It, however, led to the fragmentation of Islamism in Egypt from moderate to militant variety. In Sudan, as I said before, it led to, until recently, in 2018, the consolidation of the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan, wielding the levers of state power, and of course, for 30 years, having hegemony, political hegemony over the entire country. And then following that, of course, the disintegration of this regime under the popular protest of 2018 in Sudan. And finally, as I say in the book, or as I said before, the state collapse during the boom was really central to, of course, the history of Somalia as one of the few countries that have collapsed completely in terms of absence of bureaucratic institutions and any formal institutions of any kind until recently. But the second chapter on Sudan, for those interested in state formation, does something a little different, and it looks at the role of informal networks in state formation. And Somalia has yet another lesson for us in the sense of how does a region like Somaliland in Western Somalia build a state from scratch based on informal networks without external intervention, a new form of a state built on indigenous networks, as opposed to, let's say, other countries, and I compare it to the experiment of state building in northeastern Somalia that failed. What made Somaliland successful in the use of informal networks to build states, and what made it a failure in Puntland in the northeastern Somalia and in central Somalia, where Al-Shabaab is active? Long story short, you should read the book. It has to do with very much the Polanyi notion of both encouraging economic activity, but regulating economic activity in the context of efforts at state building. No region in Africa has done it as successfully as the state builders of Somaliland, where I lived for some time. And then the final conceptual aspect here is really crucial that I hope will be informative, and that is to really understand what Polanyi and that kind of work helps us in understanding the relation between state and markets in the Middle East and Africa. And what I've done here that you'll find is to typologize these informal markets. I'm sure you've heard about informal economic activities in a variety of different contexts, of course, but it's really important reading the literature. What we discover, of course, is that it's quite biased towards understanding what the informal market is. In theoretical terms. We have on the one side, of course, those who really focus on the intervention of the state, the excessive state regulation that leads to the expansion of informal markets. And then on the other side, we have this notion that of the neutral market. And the focus here is on the barriers to entry to that market, what Polanyi criticized as a kind of fictitious notion of the free market. There is no such thing, of course, as a self-regulating market in the abstract. And here we have this, in this case, the empirical evidence of this. The parallel market here, as I show in all of the different cases empirically, is related directly to the official economy. I'm not going to read all of this, but the official economy you can define in every country as activities whose product is reflected in national accounts. The parallel market are informal financial transfers, like labor remittances in many cases, and informal investment of banks or houses that are not regulated or taxed by the state. But the important thing here is to understand that this parallel market, of course, is linked to the formal market. And it also sits in close social and political proximity. I want to repeat that, in close social and political proximity to other markets. Here, we're not talking about one fictitious neutral market, but a plurality of markets. In this case, you have a linkage between informal financial labor remittances and informal labor and housing, in Islamic Welfare Association, all of which were directly related to and fueled by these labor remittances. Related to that also is what in the literature you'll find as termed as the illicit economy. And that is very different because it's designated by either the international community or local states or local communities as economies that are illicit, deemed illegal under any regime, hoarding, tax evasion. Recently in Sudan, gold smuggling. Sudan is the third largest exporter of gold in Africa. The majority of it, 90%, 99%, actually smuggled outside of the country. This is not a small affair. What we want to understand is that we have to move away from a descriptive, this understanding of the state and market as in opposition, and even those who recognize, of course, their relationship rarely look at these markets in a dynamic fashion. And my argument here is to understand the labor exporters and their politics in terms of domestic economy. We have to understand the markets in this fashion, and at the same time understand that they're linked directly to the boom and bust cycles of the Gulf economies. Here, just to illustrate, these are the informal markets in Somalia. You'll see the currencies here traded and denominated in dollars. And here is the informal settlement of Imbaba informal housing that I'll discuss before the conclusion. I wanted to quickly do the empirical story. It's not going to be a complete one because these are very important, complicated and important countries, but I hope in the book you'll find all of that detailed for you, if and informative. The boom of the period in these three countries led to changes of dramatic and profound nature. These three countries would never be the same after the boom in labor remittances, primarily for the reasons I told you prior, and that is that it led to the erosion of the regulatory capacity of the state. Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia, all of these states actually lost the capacity to regulate their economy. And that, of course, coincided with the expansion of informal financial networks. This led to the emergence of an Islamist commercial class in Egypt and Sudan, powerful in terms of having invested much of these informal finances in Islamic banking and Islamic institutions. That becomes a really important part of the story of the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood and their political influence and prominence throughout the 1970s, 80s, and through many years in the 1990s. The same can be said of Sudan, where the Islamists in Sudan would not have been able to capture the state if they were not profiting from monopolizing Islamic, or rather informal financial funds from the labor remittances. And as I said, Somalia also represents this kind of processes. But in Somalia, there is a big difference. And here is this relates to my point about we have to look at the diversity of Muslim majority countries. For very important reasons. Number one, the weak capacity of formal institutions in Somalia and the social structure in Somalia, the clan networks based on pastoral livelihood. Here it was not Islam, but clan that really was hardened in the context of the exposure of Somalia to international financial sources. So where Somalia is actually the most in percentage-wise, has the most Muslims, almost completely Muslim, it is one where clan and ethnic ties become much more important than Islam, despite what you have read about Somalia in conventional media accounts. So for the boom in Egypt, I call it the house the boom built. And this is a picture for those of you, I thought there may be Egyptians either here or listening. They will be very familiar with Khalid al-Shatir, who was the deputy to the Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood. He actually almost ran for the elections, but on behalf of the Muslim Brotherhood instead of Bursi, but was disqualified. But Khalid al-Shatir represents one of the financiers of the Muslim Brotherhood that was able to utilize these informal financial networks to build a great kind of Islamic banking system and institutions that popularized the Muslim Brotherhood at the time. It's important to highlight here, and I can't go into too much detail, that the Egyptian state, like all of the states at the time, actually promoted this kind of enrichment by liberalizing the economy and allowing for the kind of expansion of informal financial networks. The Egyptian state thought that this outmigration would serve as a safety valve. Egyptians migrating abroad in the context of imposing austere neoliberal reforms. All states followed these kind of policies, which is really important. But the case of Egypt is really interesting and important because it's not just about the informalization of the financial sector, but something else that becomes pivotal to our understanding of militancy in Egypt. And that is in the context of economic neoliberal reforms in Egypt, particularly in the 1980s and through the 1990s. You had the expansion of two very important markets, one in housing and the other in labor. And I'll briefly show what that entailed. This is just a depiction of the important role of Islamist welfare associations, primarily financed by labor remittances, captured by the Muslim Brotherhood in part in Egypt. Quickly, these are Islamic welfare associations that eclipse the power and influence of other charitable institutions. One from the government, these are the Development Association in Egypt that are instituted by the government, and Rawabit Iqlimiya, regional kinship-based networks or institutions in Egypt. You will see here, just as an illustration, that by the 1980s, quickly, you see during the era of boom, the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamists in general were able to substitute the welfare function of the Egyptian state at the level of community. This, of course, had the consequences of popularizing the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt at the time. But how did the Muslim Brotherhood at the local level utilize this great fortune in order to generate recruitment and discipline, commitment into their organization? In a context of a repressive state, it required a great deal of work. And in the book, I talk about and describe the young rank and file members and my discussions with them. There were a number of criteria that generate this kind of commitment. One of them is the evaluation of the behavior of the potential member. You also monitor the adherence to public morality and Islamic education. And finally, there's a demonstration of political commitment. You're essentially put to a test through a process of vetting. I'm not going to go through all of this, but just to kind of highlight that what is often obscured in the process of socialization into Islamist movements is we don't see the processes by which young men in general, some women, go through. The general member, Udu al-Am, all the way to the Mujahid or al-Udu al-Muntazim. That is the general member, then is through a variety of different test and vetting processes, is then graduated into the final essential official member, the committed member. And in the book, if you're interested, you'll see the different levels or tests and that go along with the process of tarbiyah or the recruitment. Needless to say, the most important point for us today to remember is to distinguish these Islamist Muslim Brotherhood organization by their middle class variety. And when I tell people, oh, the militants and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt represent two different social forces, often asked, well, how can that be? It seems that some of the militants are upper class as well, or middle class. In terms of rank and file, that's not the case. And here, the vetting for the Muslim Brotherhood is very specific and selective. The pre-existing education, social class, and skills in the labor market are really highlighted or vetted, the ideological commitment, and in many cases, the physical strength as well, because oftentimes that you are, you deal with of course, the security apparatus of the Egyptian state. I want to conclude with my own country then, Sudan, which is very similar, as I said, to the Egyptian case. I wanted to show that the Muslim Brotherhood or Islamist in Sudan, of course, here carrying Mohammed Mursi's poster, are, countries are very related, not only in terms of their structural relationship to the Gulf countries, but also culturally, politically. And the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan, of course, is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt that in Sudan began in the 1940s. But the changes in Sudan are a little bit even more dramatic than in the case of Egypt, not so much as in Somalia. And that is that, as I describe in the book, Sudan goes through a process of being a labor remittance economy, transforms into an oil exporting rentier economy. And at this moment, historically, it has really transformed itself, or not transformed, but political and economic changes has shifted the political economy of the country in a few years to essentially an extractive economy. All three different economic shifts have had very different political consequences for Sudanese society. Very briefly here, you can see as a proportion of GDP and exports or imports, usually labor remittances are measured as in proportion to imports. It's clear that Sudan follows, of course, during the boom, the pattern of all the labor exporters that I mentioned. Here from a survey in Sudan, very quickly, the majority of labor remittances go through informal channels. Either they're hand-delivered or they're delivered through friends and relatives, through what we call Tujar al-Shanta, suitcase merchants, who literally oftentimes carry these dollars into the country. It's very clear that percentage-wise, the majority of Sudanese continue to send remittances to their family through informal channels. This was monopolized very much by the Islamists, and I know that there's an interest in Sudan here. I also wanted to discuss this quickly because I invited some Sudanese to be part of the discussion, and we are all interested in the current situation in Sudan, but we can't understand the current situation in Sudan without understanding the development of Sudan's deep state. These are countries, authoritarian countries, that have developed in this context a deep state that links the economy to the military and security apparatus. You're familiar with this concept, I'm sure, in your poli-sci courses. In the case of Sudan, it was called a policy of empowerment, or tamkeen. And the Islamists, once they took over power, thanks to their monopolization of informal labor, financial markets, began a very astute policy of developing authority over not only politics, but the economy. And that had to do with the state being utilized to generate rents and, of course, dispense those rents to Islamist loyalists in civil society, purging non-Islamists from the bureaucracy, dissolving and breaking unions, or co-opting unions. And importantly, and this is where Sudan is different from Egypt, the national army then is eroded in the context of the development of different militias, utilized to actually not only suppress the local population, but also to undermine a national army of the type that maybe you would find, let's say, in Egypt. The consequences of this in Sudan become really important, but all of that would not have been possible without the Islamicization of the economy itself. Sudan, much more than Egypt, and here I know that some people are, especially who work on Islamic banking in let's say, Southeast Asia, are more interested in this part of the story, and that is that Sudanese Islamists were able to monopolize the Islamic banking institutions in the country. The first one was called the Faisal Islamic Bank. It was established in 1973. The shareholders also were Sudanese and Saudi Arabians. The same bank was also established in Egypt at the same time. In the case of Sudan, however, the Islamic banking experiment was monopolized by an Islamist fundamentalist organization that not only privileged Islamic banking by giving them tax-free havens and investments, allowing labor remittances to be funneled to them, but also had a very strict credit policy. Islamic banking in Sudan actually only focused mostly on foreign trade and through Islamist activists, leading to a large monopolization by Islamist middle-class activists in business. That, of course, translated into eventually the monopolization of the private sector and parts of the public sector, and that led to the popularity of Islamist activism. Most importantly, they financed the military coup of 1989, leading to a great transformation in the economy and the identity of Sudanese politics. I lied, I think. I wanted to conclude with the militancy and Imbaba, because I know there are some people here interested in the built environment. And I think that this is Cairo research, and I think for those of you who are familiar with Egypt, the issue of real estate and construction is one of the most important stories in the country. It has and continues to really influence Egyptian politics, and there is no greater threat than this issue of housing in Cairo in particular. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Imbaba, where I conducted my research, was a site of the rise of Islamic militancy and violence by the state that went into the informal settlements of Cairo in Imbaba, parts of Imbaba in Cairo, and this is very different from the Islamic quarters I told you about, and tried to eventually successfully to stamp out Islamic militant organizations belonging to Al-Jama'at Islamiyya. That part of the story is well known. I want to tell the part of the story about informal networks, not so much about militancy as such, because it has a great deal of relevance for the rest of Cairo and what we're seeing now as the state also is now in contest with those living in informal settlements, and you also witness protest in these settlements this year. Informal settlements in Cairo are not a small thing. I know that for many, they'll think that, oh, it's only a small percentage of the population. That's not the case. As you know, Professor, I'm sure this is, I don't know about Istanbul, but for Cairo, this dark color are the great the informal settlements, by which we simply mean that these are formerly agricultural lands that are settled informally, absent bureaucratic regulation. And that is something that states usually utilize as a way to deal with the housing crisis. In Egypt, at least half of the population actually lives in informal settlements. Informality is not a slum by any means. This is not equivalent. Many of these are middle-class settlements, even wealthy settlements, in addition to the poor denizens. I want to make that point clear first, and then look at the place that I researched where there was militancy, and that is Imbaba, which probably by now has 9 million in terms of the informal settlement population in Cairo, representing a very large of the Cairean population. This is the larger Imbaba area that houses millions and millions of Egyptians in informal settlements. But this is, and there's a curtain for you. I only have 2 curtains. One to announce the book, and this one, which I think is important, because as soon as I found this map in my research, thanks to my Egyptian friends in the neighborhood who insisted that to bring it to me, the story of militancy and most importantly, its causes really becomes crystal clear. This is a microcosm of the great transformation of Cairo. And by great transformation, yes, I do mean Karl Polanyi's great transformation. This is Imbaba, and it represents that microcosm. Very briefly, if Egypt's integration into the global economy that I described resulted in the informalization of informal financial markets, it also led to the expansion of informal housing and labor markets, which influenced identity politics greatly. Anwar Sadat's shift to what we term a period of hyper-liberalism and flexible specialization that downgraded wage labor and removed protection for workers becomes an essential part of the livelihoods of people living in Mbaba. But the great transformation here happened historically. And here one can tell the story of Egypt in addition to the informal housing. In the 1950s and 60s, that portion above this is what is called Western Munira, part of Mbaba, was actually patronized or benefited from the policies of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. Like all countries in Africa, the Middle East, and many developing countries, this was a period of import substitution industrialization, a period of state-led development. Here, if you look closely, if you read Arabic, you'll see that these are basically textile factories. There's a neighborhood there called Medina al-Ummal, the city of workers. This was a part of the city that Gamal Abdel Nasser and that state built to provide public housing for formal laborers working in the textile factories in particular. Throughout the 50s and 60s, a neighborhood that now has come to be associated with poverty and terrorism was actually one of the most fortunate neighborhoods in Egypt, which is really important. But the lower part of here, below the red line, is a reflection of the transformation of this neighborhood, and I would argue Cairo and Egypt generally. And that is by the 1970s and 80s, you had the informalization of housing, where you have this part really are the rise of informal settlements, not informal housing, which is very, very important. This, of course, is, by the way, fueled greatly by labor remittances. Here you see, once again, the relationship between internationalization and the informalization of housing. And very importantly, in order to deal with the construction boom, not only in the informal settlements, but throughout Cairo, there was a great deal of rural workers bid from Upper Egypt into the construction sectors in Cairo. Most of them, many of them from Aswan and Munufia and other Sohag, other parts of governance in Upper Egypt, close to where I'm from, was very, very instrumental. These rural urban migrants, similar to other big cities in the Middle East, as well as Africa, changed the culture and the economy, of course, of Cairo. And that becomes a central element of this great transformation that is really important to keep in mind. I want to make this point because it is important. This was not a result of the informalization of a so-called free market. Here we return to Polanyi again and understand that the state of Anwar Sadat and Mubarak actually intervened in order to expand the informal housing and labor, okay? Here the state intervenes to construct particular kind of markets as part and parcel of its number one economic strategy associated with economic austerity and neoliberal reform, and also to outbid the former allies of the former regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser. It sounds really difficult at this point to understand, but in this period, supporting Islamism indirectly and sometimes directly was a good strategy for Anwar Sadat, who was very much facing opposition from the left. And that becomes a part of the story of Egypt and of Cairo, which is really important. But I want to emphasize that the casual labor was drawn from not only workers from Cairo proper, but from newly urbanized Egyptians from different culture and networks from Upper Egypt. How do we explain the rise of militancy in this context? This is part of the neighborhood that saw this militancy. And I thought, how can I do it quickly? I thought maybe I'll use a quote that encapsulates from my interviews when I was there with, this is a former member of Al-Jama'at Islamiyya. How can I encapsulate why young men would would join militant organizations. When we have trouble, the Jama'ah, the Islamic group, come quickly. If someone treats you unfairly, you can go to the Muslims and they speak to him or beat him. If someone tries to flirt with your daughter, they threaten him. If you are in debt, they tell the money changer to be patient. Rather than issues of Islamic doctrine and ideology, Sayyid Qutb, but all of these things, or even this relationship to geopolitics, here it's a social and economic micro foundations that I'd like us to emphasize. This is taken from the wording of a former Islamist. It was a comprehensive strategy. I spent many months not only interviewing but attending the congregational prayers. That was very important. I want to just quickly tell you what that strategy was about, because I think it's applicable to our understanding of militancy in general. One was having to do with the weakened role of traditional institutions, as I chronicle in this book. The evaporation of the authority and legitimacy of these traditional informal networks that had competed with Islamist militant networks. And that had a great deal to do with the rural urban migration. There is, as Timothy Mitchell says, no seamless web from rural life to capitalism or wage labor, but nevertheless, this transformation was very important in eroding traditional authority. The messaging from the sermons, if you'd like, you can look at some of the sermons and how they resonated with the local community, as opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood sermons, which were very different, targeting middle class. And finally, two things. One of them is the violence associated with utilizing the strong men in the neighborhood. I don't have time to get into all the different types of strong men of Baltagiya, but we can take questions about that, of course. To explain the violence, two things have to be understood. One is that Islamist militants compete locally with other forms of identity, including clan from Upper Egypt. And another aspect is really the use of the strongmen that are not ideologically based, but rather are the strongmen in the neighborhood. And this becomes important. But I think what I'd like also to emphasize is this informal casual labor. Why would informal laborers in construction join militant organization? And I did not understand, of course, why that would be the case initially, but it had very much to do with this concept that I spoke about, and that is how informal markets have to be embedded and regulated by norms, social networks that protect and submit individuals to the market. And this is what the militants actually did, their utilization of these informal workers. And I say this in very empathetic terms to make you understand that the first adherence was not to militancy, but to the social and economic consequences of informalization and the rise of market society in Imbaba. The Al-Jama'ah Al-Islamiyya did something that was very much in line with lining up the informality of workers and these markets with a hierarchy, just as what we call, or what Egyptians call al-dolab in the construction center, a hierarchical form of contractor, foreman, teacher, sabi, who's an apprentice. This was mapped onto very deftly by the Jama'ah Islamiyya and their leaders. Here you have the hierarchy of the central leader, the head of the neighborhood, the leaders of the mosques. All of them worked in tandem. Of course, there were security officers and also rank and file. All of this becomes really important in mirroring the kind of norms already in place in the context of this neighborhood, which is really important to keep in mind. So I'm not going to belabor Sudan too much. I know there's, I can go on, well, if I have to say something, because I'm concerned about my Sudanese friends, relatives, and audience. So I will say that Sudan then represents, and there's a new book, I have a chapter on Arab protest in the Middle East and North Africa region in particular. What makes Sudan really unique is not only the mobilization structures of this revolution, but also how Sudanese were able to link informal networks of opposition, youth activists, and Sudanese professional associations, and very importantly, and I can take questions on this, resistance committees at the grassroots. This has become something that has a long history in Sudan, but youth activists here are not street protests exclusively, although that's probably what you see in the news. They are well organized, ideologically informed, and very clear about grievances that they, as an example here, demonstrate to other protesters to generate a kind of solidarity, not based on ethnicity or Islamism, but based on understood universal grievances among the Sudanese population. Here in Arabic, this is a pamphlet that essentially itemizes all of the horrendous human rights violations and corruption of the regime of the Islamists. This kind of messages in the context of organization for the resistance committees or Rijal Muqawma is only one element behind their success and sustainability. And by success here, I do mean, yes, in terms of sustainability. What Kaufmann has taught us, to keep quoting him, is this notion of being careful and doing away with the teleology that other frameworks provide. And I think that that's really important. We often miss the causal mechanisms as we're looking at the endpoint, the teleology at the end. And those kind of models no longer are satisfying for the Middle East and Africa for many of these reasons that I mentioned. And I think I need to conclude because I have really went on a lot. But all these countries mean a great deal, obviously, and the audience is diverse. So I want to conclude with how the book concludes itself, and that is how this model applies to other African and Middle East countries. And I would go as far as to say that for those of us studying these regions, we should also be increasingly confident that these models actually apply to other countries as well. Having given this talk, for example, at Stanford, people were interested in the model as it applies to, Bitcoin currencies, the new kind of currencies we see. And there are many similarities, including issues of state capacity and regulation. But here, just wanted to be clear that internationalization does affect countries, especially the labor exporting countries, in similar ways. They produce similar macro-institutional responses, by which I mean that they do erode the capacity of the state to regulate its economy. In the case of Egypt, if you're interested in that country, you'll see that there's a great debate about to what extent should the currency be stabilized or should it be floated as a way to attract even more labor remittances into the formal economy. In the case of Sudan today, the most central question is, will the government, the military government, actually implement reforms to liberalize the currency or not? And who benefits from that liberalization? Is it the Sudanese population or those who are actually monopolizing the banking system? The second conclusion, of course, is, as I mentioned, absent bureaucratic regulation and the erosion of formal institutions, we have to understand empirically how these informal markets are regulated by religious and ethnic networks. It is not, as I began this talk, the case that Muslims automatically adhere to Islam, but the cover of the book demonstrates our respect for our culture and religion, of course. But the issue here is the diversity, like all other populations, and the multiplicity of identity has to be examined empirically through rigorous field research, and also understood in the context of state policy itself. And I hope that this talk has emphasized that. And capital accumulation itself from informal financial transfers. And here it's important because this relates not only to the issue of identity politics, but issues of political violence. There is something at stake here in this model as well, because it explains not only divergence in identity politics, but it helps us explain in Africa and the Middle East the modes, nature, and the causes of particular forms of deep forms of political violence. And here, capital is often ejected from the equation. In terms of Africa and the Middle East, capital accumulated informally, and as I showed you the global map, much of it is informally is if it accrues to private groups in society, Oftentimes, state elites meet this challenge, this threat, economic and political threat, with brutal political reprisals. And if you track the violence of many of these states in terms of repression, you will often see that the ones attacked are the so-called winners from the informal economy and informal economic activity, which represents the most important source of economic livelihood for many people in Africa and in the Middle East. And so I want to conclude with that, this call or kind of point that we should really look at globalization, informal markets, and its relationship to the rise of identity, but also its relationship to political repression and violence. I went on though too long, so I'm going to, if there's Sudanese listening, I have to conclude with my country again. This is this is in memoriam to the martyrs in Sudan and the revolution that have really stirred and helped sustain and what the young people in Sudan feel is the most important cause, as they've told me. That's why I have to conclude with it always, and the issue of justice that has not been met. And it is, as they tell me, they're not fighting for control of the economy, but they're fighting for justice. So I want to conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very rich talk.
Thank you.
We have some time for questions. Will we be able to answer questions after this very long and demanding talk? So we do have some time. Maybe I'll use the microphone for those, because we have a lot of people on Zoom. Oh, okay. So we don't need to. Great. Yes.
Hi, yes, thanks so much for such an enriching talk and being very far-reaching. I just was curious about the relationship between some of the militant groups and the welfare organizations, the Islamic welfare organizations or associations. Well, one also, I just think, some of these militant groups also do sort of social services, have their own sort of welfare wigs as well? I don't know, Hezbollah style. I'm just curious about that. And then if not, do they collaborate with some of the very informal kind of Islamic charity groups or just the local groups as well?
That's a great question. You want to follow up? Okay, sure. Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is no. And I'm so glad you asked this question, because I think that when I showed that chart of the expansion of Islamic welfare, that is really associated with the Muslim Brotherhood organization. It is also, if you read the work of Clark and others, these are Islamic welfare associations that really support not only members of the Muslim Brotherhood but general population. And that's really important. It's one of the reasons for their popularity. They actually they're not completely charitable, as you know. They offer graduated fees in order to really keep the upkeep. And in the second chapter on Egypt, I detail the middle class nature and how that operates. It's not a militant organization. The militants actually don't have Islamic welfare organization. This is kind of a point I really want to make about the global war on terrorism. I've had this debate, believe it or not, even with Tony Blair, if you can imagine, because at that time in the UK, they were criminalizing Islamic welfare associations. And we were trying to explain to him and others that these are not actually militant organizations, and they are not even completely charitable, and they represent a third way in the context of neoliberal reforms. And this is why they're popular. Their criminalization and repression has to do with other political objectives. The militants actually were not successful in doing that. They didn't have that, they didn't generate the wealth, but they did generate, of course, these economic incentives for a select small group of young men. And it was done very carefully, but the economic incentives were not really as strong as the normative incentives. And I hope that that comes out in the book, because I describe the very nature of pauperization in this neighborhood, especially for young adolescent men. The neighborhood mosque and sermons were much more impactful than the kind of economic incentives, because, and I go through the sermons, they resonated for even the issues of discussing reinvigorating the patriarchal family, gender relations, all of that is included, resonated with a community going through this informalization process and deep structural social and economic changes. And I hope that that is relevant for understanding of militancy in general, not to look at militancy as an outcome to be explained, but the rank and file. So I hope this contribution here is not, I don't really care about the leaders. I don't know who does, but what we don't know about is the rank and file. But no, they're not related to the Islamic Welfare Association.
So there was a question here, and then.
Hi, thank you so much for the book. I really liked it, and I really liked the lecture. So I want to thank you so much. I have a question regarding the Kaufmann analysis and like the analysis in the book, because it was really like enlightening for me, and it really answered a lot of questions like rupture in the social and political like ties and spirit, and how is it like, and how the double movement of like, and you say that in the book somehow, like the protectionism, like the society tries to slow down the change by new ties or by sort of like, but also, so the idea of that we are going away from the regulation of the state through these circles, but still we are protecting ourselves from the state, and we are being affected by the market at the same time. So this kind of like movement. But what I was thinking about, it takes different shapes at different moments, at different geographical settings. So in our region, it took the shape of the Islamist movements, or this is what you are trying, or this is how I understood it. So I have to question why, and like why specifically when it became a question of identity or protectionism, or like, is it because where the money is coming from, where the like, is it like, and how influential this is, and how do we see the future in that sense, like given that it's a decline, as you say, like it's a Boston. Yeah, I would love to question. I need to. Yeah.
What a great question. Yeah, absolutely. The number one, I think I see Kaufmann in two ways. The double movement I see metaphorically in a way. I think that you open yourself up to criticism if you want it to be mapped out like in a teleology. And I think that the way I read him is that was opens up a nonlinear understanding and understanding divergence, and that the double movement then becomes one that has to be tested out empirically or proven empirically. It opens up that, and I know there's critiques on either side, but I think that that's important. And frankly, I found it so empirically relevant. You can read the book, you'll see I didn't come up with these things. So I think that would be really important. Why is it in our region, Islamism as opposed to other forms of identity in the context of this marketization processes? Is that the question? I think that in the book I make clear that requires really, and I'm glad that Commendation put it, requires really knowing the cases and having knowledge over the countries deeply, and eliciting other people who have knowledge over the country. This is the kind of research that I think in political science requires knowing your cases, as we like to put it. That's number one. Because you have to map out the local structural, religious, and even socioeconomic structures in order to understand why that is the case. In the case of Islamism as such, Islamism, of course, is not directly related to these linkages. You know, it has a long history of imperialism, colonialism, a prior history to even the Salafiyya that we lecture about a lot. But here I talk about political saliency. I'm not really discussing the, origins of Islamism. It's really a question of why Islamism has become powerful politically. That's a different question. And that I don't think we can answer without the transnational linkages. I really don't. I just don't. I know that this is what some reviewers said about the book. It's really interesting that many books don't take the transnational linkages seriously enough. But I don't think we'd have Islamism as a politically salient, powerful, and I think that will track with its future trajectory. Yeah.
Maybe we can have two questions together.
Okay.
So that we can have two last questions. Yes, there were two questions. Yes. Go ahead.
My question actually nicely dovetails with what you said about knowing your cases, because I'm from Somaliland, and I was kind of struck by the big generalizations of lumping Somalia and Somaliland together, especially when you have the grasp of cities, and not just out of like, political affiliations, but more about, we're talking about informal economies. And in the case of Somaliland, which have three of the four cities that you listed, were in Somaliland, the Hawala diagram that you drew doesn't necessarily hold up in post-2010, when there is not the old somebody calls, and that's how money is transferred, but that there is highly sophisticated mobile banking that is being trying to be regulated. That's not entirely divorced from Islamist networks, but that's not entirely, mostly it's not Islamist networks. They have Shield, the guy who owns War Remedies from Hargeisa. All of these things actually have ways that are maybe not recognizable in terms of like Chase Bank, but that all have paper trail, that are being institutionalized. And also that there is a functioning government that we can talk about different various levels of state capacity, but that is actually trying to negotiate this level of state capacity. It's not entirely indigenous. They are trying to build a modern state, right? And then obviously they're not entirely successful, but for me, the discussions about the overemphasis on the informal networks felt like it didn't necessarily fully capture all of these, the way that the guy who owns Tax Shield is very close with the ruling party, right? And that the state is trying to intervene in currency exchanges, in regulating mobile banking. And now you can't even have a SIM card without having an identity card, right? So that informal network may still be at some way present, but it's not the governing paradigm. It's kind of, for me at least, like only understanding from the local level, misses the all of these levels of all this effort to try to institutionalize, right? And that for me is important because it shows that it's not just about like semantics, it's about honoring all of the work that's going on in building institutions, right? That's really different than talking about competition.
Okay, we have to have two questions together. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. Just take a thought.
Okay.
I have a question that sort of builds on that.
Can you ask it
Very quickly, yeah, I'm curious if you could maybe talk about the way in which exchange rates are being manipulated for Hawala networks or exchanges by state governments, because I think it might get to that question in an interesting way.
Yeah, well, first of all, I am glad you asked this question. And let's see, I was telling a Somali colleague that I want to give this talk in Somalia. And the reason for that is that actually that is included in the book. The reason I mentioned that there's such an interest on Islamism and of course Egypt and Sudan and these things. But I wanted to emphasize in Somalia, that period I was talking about in terms of the period of the boom, but actually, and that's the first chapter on Somalia. The second chapter is on state building and how the informal and formal come together. And what I mean by that is that it's exactly right. Hopefully you read it in the sense that this is where the model comes in, including the negotiation between the telecommunication barons and their relationship to state building, and how Ibrahim Egal, the late president, actually negotiated formal and informal linkages with these big barons as they became stronger in the sector. Okay, and as you know, as being a Somali, that one of the biggest issues had to do with convincing them to be taxed. The challenge for state builders in Somaliland was how to, generate taxes and still encourage the private sector. And that, if you read that chapter, went and. All I can say, I wish the chapter was here, I'll read it for you. This is where I have interviews that describe the exchange rate policies and their conflicts among livestock traders outside of Hargeisa. Okay, and this is really your question. The problem was that initially Somaliland leaders were overtaxing the livestock traders. Livestock traders exited out of the economy. which is very, very difficult. And they actually had and coerced Muhammad Iqbal and others to relieve the tax burden and to liberalize the exchange. Okay. That conflict between livestock traders and nascent state builders is why over time, because state formation is a process, you see the success of Somaliland. Then I'll go to Puntland in the same chapter, and I'll show how that overtaxation and the inability of those in Puntland, the Majeerteen, Puntland maybe, to actually get Abdurrahman Yusuf to reduce the tax burden and liberalize the exchange rate there. So the whole process was exactly what you said, okay? And that rise of the telecommunication barons, Dahabshil and others that expand their markets, really is the reason that Somaliland has been successful. That tax generated, Somaliland has used to have some semblance of a national army and a police from different clans. The final equation for you as a Somalia is to understand the role of the Shia and the traditional negotiation process that made all this possible.
I do understand.
Yes, yeah.
So maybe it's time to carry this to the reception. We have a short reception and what is it again? It's an Imperial Art Gallery, which is just down the hallway on the lower level, the opposite. Okay, so please come and join the discussion there. Okay, but thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Did you enjoy?
I can't.
Yes, see, I got it.
You want to? Maybe I will actually join your one. I'm not like, Sorry, what? You don't have others. Right. No, it's public service now. Very happy.
Oh, that'd be nice. Thank you. I don't have. I know.
I still look like those. Yeah.
I was going to take this mic with me. Thank you so much.
Unless she needs me online. I know about the budget. It's like the layers of like.
I have to slap it at 9 p.m. Put you to sleep? No. Okay. Oh, I thought you were